guys, so today we're going to go through the Anatomy and Physiology 2 lab portion that focuses on circulation. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on all of the blood vessels that are involved in the circulatory system. We'll start with pulmonary circulation, which brings deoxygenated blood to the lungs to get oxygen and then brings it back to the heart. Okay? And then after that, we'll go through systemic circulation, which is where we take the oxygenated blood from the heart and deliver it to all of the tissues in the body. And then we take that deoxygenated blood and bring it back to the heart. Okay, so obviously systemic circulation is going to be a lot more complicated. Okay, we're going to have a lot more vessels involved. So we'll just start with pulmonary circulation, and we should be able to go through this very quickly. Okay? So if we look at the heart here, okay, we can see this very large blue vessel, okay, that's coming up out of the right atrium or right ventricle. Okay, this large blue vessel here is the pulmonary trunk artery. Okay, you say, wait a minute, artery? Aren't arteries red? And that's true. Arteries are typically red. When we look at all of the vessels in systemic circulation, our arteries are all colored red. Okay, and that's because they have oxygenated blood. Okay, remember, when hemoglobin has oxygen bound to it, it's a very, very vibrant red color. So that's why we color arteries red. But when we look at pulmonary circulation, this is the only case in the body where our arteries, okay, arteries go away from the heart, have deoxygenated blood, okay, because they're bringing the blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Okay, so in pulmonary circulation, our arteries will be blue and our veins will be red. Okay, so the first vessel here is our pulmonary trunk artery. Okay, when we get to the back of the heart, we see that that vessel splits. Okay, and it goes to each side. These are our pulmonary arteries. Okay, so we have on this side here, we have our left pulmonary arteries. And then on this side here, we have our right pulmonary artery. Okay, so then the blood is in the lungs picking up oxygen, and then we're going to return it back to the heart. Okay, and it's going to come back into the left atrium, which we see here. Okay, so these vessels here, these little red stumps that you see on either side of this left atrium, are our pulmonary veins. Okay, our pulmonary veins. So you'll notice that on either side, we have one on top and one on bottom. Okay, so that would be our superior pulmonary vein and our inferior pulmonary vein. Okay, so then you also have to associate the side of the heart that you're talking about. Okay, so if we look at the heart, we see that this ventricle here is bigger, right? So that must be the left side of the heart. So the vessels on this side are left. Okay, so the superior left pulmonary vein, and then on the bottom, the inferior left pulmonary vein. Then these ones are the right side. Okay, so the superior right pulmonary vein, and then on the bottom, the inferior right pulmonary vein. Okay, so we can also look at those vessels on a model that actually shows the lungs. Okay, so you see that you have the heart in the middle, the lungs on either side. This lung here has actually been sectioned or opened up so that we can see the vessels entering the lungs. Okay, so we still have our pulmonary trunk artery coming out of the heart. Okay, and then on this model, you can only see this side, so you can see the left pulmonary artery. Okay, so pulmonary trunk artery, the left pulmonary artery, and you can see the left pulmonary arteries all throughout the lungs. So any of these blue vessels, okay, we could point to any of these blue vessels and they would be left pulmonary arteries. Okay, then the blood picks up oxygen and we start to carry it back to the heart. So any of these red vessels here in the lungs, okay, would be our pulmonary veins. Left side of the heart, so our left pulmonary veins. And then if we turn the model a little bit, I don't know if you guys can see this, but you can just start to see that there is a superior on top and inferior on the bottom. okay? So the left superior pulmonary vein, okay, and inferior pulmonary vein, okay? So that's it for pulmonary circulation, okay? Very, very simple, okay? Now we'll start to talk about systemic circulation, okay? So once we have that oxygenated blood down here in the left ventricle is going to contract, pump that oxygenated blood out of the heart and distribute it to the entire body, okay? So that all of our peripheral tissues and our peripheral organs can get that oxygen-rich blood, okay? And then we're going to take that blood, once the oxygen's been delivered, we'll take that deoxygenated blood and we'll bring it back to the heart so that we can pick up oxygen again in the lungs. So when we look at this heart model here, okay, we can see that oxygenated blood leaves the left ventricle via this very large vessel right here, and this is the aorta. Okay, and the aorta actually has multiple parts to it. This part that comes up is the ascending aorta. Ascend means to go up, okay, so the ascending aorta. Then we have the aortic arch, okay, the curved portion, okay, it's like an arc or an arch. So the aortic arch, or sometimes you'll hear arch of aorta, either one is fine. Then the aorta starts to go down, okay, so this portion right here is showing you the very beginning of the descending aorta, okay, descend means to go down, okay. The descending aorta actually has two different parts to it. Okay, it's a very, very large vessel that goes all the way down to about the belly button. Okay, so if you look at this model here, this big, huge red vessel, this big red vessel that we see right here, okay, is the descending aorta, as is this big red vessel down here. So, above the diaphragm, okay, this area above the diaphragm remembers the thoracic cavity. Okay, so the part of the descending aorta that's up here in the thoracic cavity is called the thoracic aorta. Okay, the thoracic aorta up in the chest. This part of the aorta that's down here is the abdominal aorta. Okay, down in the abdomen. If we were to look on this model right here, okay, you can see the ascending aorta coming up, the aortic arch where it curves, the beginning of the descending aorta right here up in the thoracic cavity, so this would be the thoracic aorta, just starting. You can't see the rest of it on this model because it's behind the heart. But if we look down here beneath the diaphragm, you can see the abdominal aorta, okay? So when we look at the aorta, we see that there are three big major branches that come right off the aortic arch, okay? See the aortic arch, and we have branch 1, 2, and 3. This first branch here is the right brachiocephalic trunk artery. Okay? When we're looking at the arteries, we only have one brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, you'll see when we get to the veins that we actually have two brachiocephalic trunks. Okay, so don't get confused on that. With the arteries, this first branch here is the brachiocephalic trunk artery. Okay? After that, the next vessel that we have is the left common carotid artery. And then the third one here is the left subclavian artery. Okay? And it's a lot easier to remember what those branches are, what those vessels are, when we look at one of the larger models. Okay? So for instance, if we look at this model here, okay, here we see the first branch coming off, and that's the brachiocephalic trunk artery, okay, on the right side. So it comes up here and then right here, and then it branches, okay, and it goes up the neck and over here by the collarbone or clavicle. Okay, and we'll look at these branches in a second. The next vessel that comes up off the aorta, we said is the left common carotid artery. Okay, it comes up here and comes all the way up the side of the neck. Okay, all the way up to about here. And then the next one we can't really see very well is the left subclavian artery. Okay, and if we look at this model here, we can see those better. Okay, so again, coming up off of the aortic arch. Okay, the first branch is the right brachiocephalic trunk artery. Comes up here and then it splits into a vessel that goes up the neck and one that goes by the collarbone. Okay, the next branch here is the left common carotid artery. It comes up off the aorta and comes all the way up the side of the neck. The final branch off the aortic arch, okay, is the left subclavian artery. Okay, it comes up and it curves over here and comes this way until about right here. Okay, comes until after this first rib. You see the ribs are these little white splotches. So the subclavian comes until right after the first rib. We call this subclavian because it sits right beneath the clavicle. Okay, remember your clavicle is your collarbone. Subclavian. Okay, the vessel goes beneath the clavicle. Okay? So, we also have a subclavian artery and a common carotid artery on the right side. Okay? It's just that on the right side, these vessels branch off of the brachiocephalic artery. Okay? So on the right side, we had our brachiocephalic trunk artery come up, and then it branches into the right common carotid artery that goes up the neck, and the right subclavian artery that goes under the clavicle over here until right after the first rib. Okay? So let's go ahead and follow the common carotid up to the head, and we'll look at all of the arteries in the head and then inside the skull. Okay? So we call the common carotid artery the common carotid because it splits, okay, and it branches into an external carotid and an internal carotid. And you can see that right here, okay? The common carotid artery goes up, and then you can see this Y, okay? And the Y is where it splits into the external carotid and the internal carotid. And if you look at our skull model, this is where it's really easiest to see that. So, if I turn it this way, hopefully you can see that right here on the bottom, we have the common carotid artery going up the side of the neck. Then you see this Y, okay, where it splits. The one that goes to the inside and then it goes up and enters the inside of the skull is the internal carotid artery. This one that comes to the outside and feeds the outside of the skull, okay, is the external carotid artery. Okay, so common carotid artery, internal carotid artery, external carotid artery. When we look at the external carotid artery, we see that there are three major branches that you guys need to know. Okay, the facial artery is this branch that comes over here to the face. Okay, it comes over to the jaw. The facial artery, okay, feeds the face. Next, we have a branch, okay, that comes back in this direction and goes to the back of the head. Remember, in the back of the head, the bone is the occipital bone. So, this artery is the occipital artery. Finally, we have the branch that goes straight up. Okay, remember that this bone here is the temporal bone. Okay, or this is your temple. Okay, so the temporal artery goes right up over the temporal bone. Okay, so common carotid artery branches into the internal carotid artery and the external carotid artery. The external carotid artery has the facial artery, the occipital artery to the back, and the temporal artery straight up over the temporal bone or the temple. Okay? So, if we look at this, decapitated. If we look at this skull model here, we also see that there's this vessel here, okay, that runs all the way up the spine, okay, and it passes through the foramen or the hole in each of these vertebrae. Okay, so this artery that passes through each of the vertebrae is the vertebral artery, okay, or the vertebral artery. Okay? If we follow this vertebral artery all the way up to the top, we see that it enters into the skull, okay, right here in the foramen magnum, okay, the big large hole at the base of the skull. And we see that there's a vertebral artery that enters on either side of the foramen magnum. Okay, so right here and right here are both our vertebral arteries or vertebral arteries. They join together to form this vessel right here. Okay, that's the basilar artery. Okay, it's at the base of the skull, the basilar artery. The basilar artery is going to branch out, okay, into the posterior cerebral arteries. Okay, then we have the posterior communicating arteries that go forward. Okay, then if we jump up here, we have our anterior cerebral arteries, okay, and our anterior communicating artery that connects the two. If we look at these few vessels, okay, and we combine them together, okay, the anterior cerebral and communicating, combined with the posterior cerebral and communicating, we see that we form this kind of circular, route, okay, this circular connective vessels. These all together are known as the circle of Willis. Okay, and that's what I want you to know them as. I want you to know that those are the circle of Willis. Okay, and the circle of Willis surrounds the pituitary gland. Okay, remember where the pituitary gland hangs down from the bottom of the brain from the infundibulum? Okay, and the pituitary gland is very, very important endocrine structure. Okay, it releases tons of important hormones that direct different metabolic rates in the whole body. Okay, so that's a very important structure. It's very important that it has an adequate blood supply. Okay, so we had our vertebral arteries coming together to form the basilar artery. Then we have our circle of Willis, okay, with these combined vessels. Okay, also I want you guys to know that, see these big large vessels right here, and then this one on this side? Those are where the internal carotid arteries enter the brain. Okay, they enter into the brain at the right here and then right here, and those internal carotid arteries go out, okay, and form the middle cerebral arteries. So right here and right here are where the middle cerebral arteries begin, and they go outward. Okay? So that's it for the skull. Okay, now we're going to go back down here and we'll start looking at the vessels down the arm. Okay? Remember that we said right here we have our subclavian artery. Okay, the vessel that goes beneath the clavicle or collarbone. And we said that the subclavian artery goes until right past this first rib. Okay, so it goes until right here. Then it becomes a vessel called the axillary artery. Remember that your underarm is the axilla. Okay, so the vessel that goes through the underarm area is the axillary artery. In the upper arm, the axillary artery turns into the brachial artery. Okay, so this big major red vessel in the upper arm is the brachial artery. Comes down here, and right at the inner elbow, it branches. Okay, the brachial artery branches into a vessel on the thumb side, and a vessel on the pinky side. Okay? And these vessels are named for the two bones that are in the forearm. Okay, remember that on the thumb side of the forearm we have the radius, and on the pinky side of the forearm we have the ulna. Okay, so the arteries are just named for those bones. If we go from the inner elbow down the thumb side, we have the radial artery. Okay, from the inner elbow down the pinky side, we have the ulnar artery. And those will come down here and they'll form these little circular vessels, okay, these little arches on the palm of the hand. And those are called the palmar arches, okay? So we could also look at an arm model like this, okay? And just because the model looks different, it doesn't have to be confusing. Okay, if you know where the vessel starts and stops, you can always figure out which vessel it is. Okay, so looking here, okay, if this were my arm like this, okay, you would know that this vessel right here is going on the underarm area. Okay, so that would be the axillary artery. We know that the axillary artery in the upper arm, so right here, becomes the brachial artery. Okay, and you can see the brachial runs down right here until the inner elbow. At the inner elbow, you can see that it splits. Okay, right here you see that Y comes this way and then down this way. This vessel here goes all the way down the forearm to the thumb side. So that must be the radial artery. This other one here we can follow, comes down here and all the way down the forearm on the pinky side. So that's the ulnar artery. And then when we look on the palm, we can see these little arches. Okay, so those are the palmar arches. We could also look at this type of a model. Okay, and again, we can still figure out the vessels. If you imagine that this goes just like this, okay, you see that this red vessel here is in the axillary area, the underarm. Okay, so this is the axillary artery right here. Okay, if I move these veins out of the way, we can see a little bit easier. Okay, you see this main red vessel in the upper arm. Okay, so that's the brachial artery. At the inner elbow, you see that it branches into these two major large branches. This one goes down the pinky side, so that's the ulnar artery. This one over here goes down the thumb side, so that's the radial artery. And then if we look all the way down here, okay, on the palms of the hands, you see these little arches. Okay, these little circular areas. These are the palmar arches. Okay? So, from there, we start to head down, okay, down into the abdominal pelvic area. Okay? So we have our thoracic aorta, and then once we pass the diaphragm, we have our abdominal aorta. And if we look at our abdominal aorta, okay, we see that we have many different vessels that branch off of it in the abdomen. And these vessels are all coming off to feed the organs that are down here in the abdomen. Okay, we have our liver, our spleen, our kidneys, our intestines, okay, our ovaries or our testes, all sorts of organs down here that we need to bring blood to. Okay? So, when we first go down past the diaphragm, this first major, this trunk here, okay, this little nub that you see right here is the celiac trunk artery. And this one actually has multiple branches, okay, that go off in all different directions. That's why it's a trunk. Okay, so the celiac trunk artery. The next big nub that you see right here is where the superior mesenteric artery comes off. and that's going to go off to the upper parts of the intestines. Okay? Next, we see these two red vessels here, okay, that go off to either side to these kidney bean-shaped organs. Okay, these are the kidneys, and anything having to do with the kidneys is typically called renal. Okay? So these two short vessels that go on either side to the kidneys are the renal arteries. So the right renal artery and the left renal artery. Then going down the abdominal aorta, we see these very thin little red vessels that go down on either side. Okay, so we've got one on this side and one on this side. Those are the gonadal arteries. Okay, they go to the gonads. So if we're looking at a female patient, they're going to be ovarian arteries that go to the ovaries. If we're looking at a male patient, they're testicular arteries that are going to the testicles. Okay, but you see that they proceed down on either side. Here's this one. Here we go. From here down. Okay, the gonadal arteries. Then the last little branch off of the aorta that we see is just right here. You can barely see a little nub. Okay, and that's where the inferior mesenteric artery would come off. And that goes to the last parts of the intestines. Okay, so the sigmoid colon, the rectum. Okay. So we can look at this model here, okay, and we can see where some of these branches go a little bit better. Okay, for example, right here, okay, this is the diaphragm. So right after we go past the diaphragm, the first branch that we see here, remember, is the celiac trunk artery. And when we look at this model, we can see where the different vessels are going. So the celiac trunk artery has a branch that comes over here to the right to this big organ, which is the liver. Okay? Things having to do with the liver are called hepatic. Hepatic with an H. So this vessel is the hepatic artery. Okay? Then we see that there's one going off to the left side, and it's going to the spleen. Okay, this organ over here is the spleen. So this vessel is the splenic artery. Okay? We also have a branch off of our celiac trunk artery that goes up, and then you can just start to see how it kind of curves. Okay? And that's the left gastric artery. Okay, and the stomach actually sits right here. Okay, we can't see it in this model, but it sits right here. So the left gastric artery comes up and wraps around the stomach. Okay? So our celiac trunk artery has a branch called the hepatic artery, the left gastric artery, and the splenic artery. Then we have this next nub here, okay, the next nub on the aorta is the superior mesenteric artery. Okay, remember, it goes to the intestines. We also see our renal arteries there and here. Okay, so the left renal artery and the right renal artery going to the kidneys. Okay. Then we see our long, thin gonadal arteries going down on either side. And then we see our inferior mesenteric artery. Okay, the last little branch coming off. Okay. So then once we get to the very bottom of the abdominal aorta, right here, we see that it branches. It has two major branches, okay? These are the common iliac arteries. So we have our right common iliac artery and our left common iliac artery. Common iliac because it branches into an external iliac and an internal iliac, okay? So common iliac artery branches. You can see that external iliac artery, okay, comes out this way and heads down towards the leg. The internal iliac artery comes in this way and it heads in towards the back of the pelvis. Okay? As soon as this external iliac artery breaks through the abdominal wall or breaches the abdominal wall, it becomes the femoral artery. Okay, the femoral artery, the large artery at the top or the thigh portion of the leg, and it goes alongside the femur. Okay, the big bone in the thigh is the femur. So that's why this is called the femoral artery. Okay? Let's just look at the iliacs really quick on the torso model, and then we'll proceed down the leg. Okay, so we went all the way down our abdominal aorta. Okay, remember we said that splits into the common iliac arteries. So we have our left common iliac artery and our right common iliac artery. Then you can see the common iliac splits into the external iliac artery and the internal iliac artery. And this model really shows you how the internal iliac artery proceeds down in towards the back of the pelvic region. Okay? Then our external iliac artery proceeds down, and then this is showing the abdominal wall. Okay? So it goes down through the abdominal wall, and you can see right here where it just begins the femoral artery. Okay? Okay, so our external iliac, okay, went through the abdominal wall, became the femoral artery. Okay, the femoral artery at the back of the knee becomes the popliteal artery. Remember the back of the knee, the region there is called the popliteal. Okay, that's the popliteal area. So the femoral artery, the popliteal artery, and then once we go past the back of the knee, the popliteal splits, okay? And it splits into one vessel that curves around to the front of the tibia and one vessel that extends down the back of the tibia, okay? Remember the tibia is the larger bone down the lower leg, okay? So the vessel that curves around to the front of the tibia is the anterior tibial artery. So you can see it just start here, and then you can see the end of it down here. Okay, anterior tibial artery. On this side, you can see the whole thing right here. Okay? So then if we come back over here, okay, remember we had the femoral artery, the popliteal artery, then it split into the anterior tibial artery, and then the back, the posterior tibial artery. Okay, down the back of the tibia. The posterior tibial artery goes down to the bottom of the foot and forms little arches on the bottom of the foot. These are called the plantar arches. Okay, the plantar arches. Think about it, if you plant your foot, when you plant your foot on the ground, you're putting the bottom of your foot down on the ground. Okay, so the plantar arches are on the bottom of the foot. The anterior tibial artery, right here at the top of the ankle, becomes another vessel called the arcuate artery, or sometimes you'll see dorsalis pedis artery. Okay, the arcuate or dorsalis pedis then forms arches on the back side or the top of the foot. Okay, these are called the dorsal arches. Okay, dorsal, think of it like a dorsal fin on a whale is on the top side of the whale. Okay, so the dorsal arches are on the top side of the foot. Okay? So the last thing we'll do is just look at these leg arteries on the big muscular model. So if we look here, we have our leg coming up, okay, our hip, and you can just kind of see the bottom portion of the pelvis, okay? So you can see the common iliac artery coming down, and it splits. The external iliac artery proceeds down towards the leg. The internal iliac artery goes back into the back portions of the pelvis. So common iliac artery, external iliac artery, internal iliac artery. If we follow the external iliac artery, once we pass through the abdominal wall and enter the leg, we become the femoral artery. And we can follow the femoral artery all the way down, and then if we turn the leg around, we see that it comes towards the back of the leg. It wraps around the femur. Okay, it wraps around the femur. So we see it come out right here, back of the femur. Still the femoral artery. Then about right here, it becomes the popliteal artery. Okay, the popliteal artery goes in the back of the knee. Okay? So we follow the popliteal artery down, and then we see that it splits. Okay? And it has one portion right here that wraps around and curves around to the front of the tibia. Okay? That's the anterior tibial artery. Okay, down the front of the tibia. We look in the back again. Okay, the part that remains in the back of the leg is the posterior tibial artery. Okay, remember the posterior tibial artery goes down to the bottom of the foot, and we can't see them here, but it forms the plantar arches on the bottom of the foot. Okay, the anterior tibial artery, okay, comes down the front of the leg, and then at the ankle area here, it forms, can't see it, but it forms the dorsalis pedis artery, okay, or the arcuate artery. Then, right here, on the dorsal part of the foot, we have the dorsal arches, okay? And that's it for the arteries that we have to know for the class. Okay, I'll make a separate video for the veins, and then one final video that goes into detail on hepatic portal circulation. Okay? Please post any questions that you have.